The slides are there. Okay, right, we will begin. Apologies if anybody's been putting up with us trying to get the technology sorted out. Right, we'll begin. Good afternoon to you, students of the City Business School in Moscow. I hope you're all well this afternoon and looking forward to this webinar. We're finally getting going after sorting out the technology problems. So, who am I? My name is Deborah Labbate, and I'm based in the UK. I currently work as a business consultant across a range of sectors, from manufacturing through to service businesses and a whole host of stuff in between. My background is totally business. I've been in the SME space all my working life. In the past, I've run car rental companies, petrol stations, car body repairs, so quite diverse. And as you can well imagine, during all those years in business, I've had a lot of decision making to do and had to do a lot of critical thinking. And I help my clients with this. And what I'm going to be sharing with you today is one of the models that we work to when we're going through the decision making process. So I'm going to share some slides with you because I think that will make it easier for you to follow. So if you just bear with me a second, I'll switch screens so that you can see the slides. Here we go. And there we have it. Okay, so it's critical thinking and decision making that we're going to be talking about today. And it's, we make decisions and solve problems every day of our lives, whether they're in business or personally. We're doing it all the time. But in this session, what we're going to be exploring is how to slow down that thinking process so that we can actually understand it. Then we will understand why we make the decisions that we do. And I'll be happy to answer your questions at the end. Okay, so in this presentation, you'll find, hopefully, that this is a straightforward procedure for clear thinking, and I believe it has universal relevance from business innovation and the critical decisions that we have to make through to choosing your next holiday, from coping with huge world issues to organizing your office and workspace. You can use this process for any of these decisions. This methodology demonstrates a technique for solving problems and for recognizing and evaluating opportunities, which allow us to take time to examine the situation, come up with alternatives, and choose the right one, the right decision for the context. This methodology will reveal where the ideas come from and demonstrate how to come up with new ones, and help to define creativity by placing it at the heart of the innovation. Moreover, I think it shows that creativity is a practical skill which can be taught and learnt by everybody. So there's 3 sections to this: define, discover, and determine. At the end of the definition stage, you should be able to present a clear analysis of the problem together with a strategy to attempt a solution. And if that's not the case, then what you need to do, quite simply, is repeat the process. Actually understanding the problem is really half of the solution. So we need to establish the facts, where we are and where we actually want to be. So to establish the facts and decide where you are and where you want to be, there's a number of things that you need to go through and questions that you need to be asking yourself. So whose is the problem? Is it your customers? Or is it yours? Is it important or is it urgent? Is a stopgap solution appropriate? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Should the solution maybe be outsourced? Is it possible for a complex problem to be broken down into manageable parts? And that can make it easier to actually, come to a decision with it. Can you set sub-goals on the way to complete the solution? What are the consequences of a partial solution? And has the definition solved the problem? Sometimes actually defining in detail what the problem is can actually solve the problem itself. But what we're wanting to do here is really slow the process down. At the end of the discovery stage, the possibilities should be beginning to take shape. And again, if that's not the case, then you need to repeat the process. If you want to generate lots of extraordinary ideas, simply take an ordinary idea and tweak it a bit. Turn it inside out, upside down, reverse it, modify it, break it up, play around with the bits, substitute and remove or add new parts, recombine it in a different way. Look at your problem from a different point of view, introduce some totally random elements and go on one step beyond that. Imagine the perfect solution and how you could achieve the direct opposite of what you want. These are all really good questions to be asking yourself. There are a few basic rules to follow, though, as you're going through this process, and this will help you to make the most out of a creative idea generation situation. So what you need to do is you need to suspend disbelief. You need to leave your ego at the door, and you don't want to criticize. You don't want to judge. This will come later, but at this point, there's no such thing as a silly idea. It really is just putting all the possibilities out on the table. I suggest writing a lot of this down as you're going through the process so that you don't forget or dismiss anything too soon. It's about quantity rather than quality at this point in time. And as I said, there's no judgment at this stage, and no idea is silly. There's an example with post-it notes, which I'm sure many of us use, and the people at 3M were trying to come up with some kind of reusable glue, and the first ideas weren't working, but that's where the idea of post-it notes came from. So don't dismiss anything, because sometimes the really good things come out of those initial ideas, which can seem a little bit silly or a little bit odd. You need to sort of keep it a bit short and switch off for a while, and then evaluate and maybe try again, because that gives the brain a little bit of time to catch up and gives you a little bit of extra thinking time. And remember that being creative isn't an exclusive ability that's only available to a very few special people. It's actually a very special ability that's available to us all. At the end of the determination stage, you should have a practical response to the questions posed by your problem definition. That's why it's really important to get that definition right in the first place. And if not, reframe your question and repeat the process from the beginning. So, questions to ask at each stage. How do the solutions match to your goals? Which is the most realistic chance of success? What extra resources may you need to implement your solution? How will the solution affect you? And what will the response be from others? These are all questions to consider. Which solution is the most appropriate? What are the risks? How will you monitor implementation? Will you have the flexibility to react to feedback? Can you cope with any likely obstacles? And could you cope with a runaway success? Now, that's really important to consider that. So, if whatever the context of this is massively successful, have you got all the resources and everything to be able to cope with that success? So you really need to think this through. Each of these phases should be separated to allow ideas to incubate, to soak, as it were. When we separate and slow down the thinking process, it doesn't necessarily mean postponing or delaying the decision making. There's an expression of putting something on the back burner, and the idea with that is the full expectation is when we return, it will be cooked. So the deliberate separation of convergent and divergent thinking styles, together with the insistence of allowing space for reflection, results in 3 distinct phases to virtually all non-automatic thought processes as we describe them. So we pose the question, we look at the alternatives, and we choose from those alternatives. In this way, the process is fractal, tending to be threefold, each stage reflecting the following characteristics. So at the definition stage, it's all about preparation. What do we know and where do we want to be? This is about questioning, being investigative, diagnostic, methodical, analytical, and bringing about clarity of vision. In the discovery stage, this is about idea generation. How can we engineer possibilities? Here we need to be free thinking, open-minded, be relaxed, uncritical, non-judgmental, and be tolerant of uncertainty at this stage. When it comes to the determination stage, this concerns the ideas evaluation. So you assess the possibilities. Have we made any progress? Here we need our judgment and choice. We need to be critical, logical, reasoned, and refocus the vision. The results of stage 3, the evaluation stage, should form the basis of stage 1, i.e. the preparation of the next phase. And if it doesn't, then you must return to the start. It's an iterative process. And this is the process for calculating a desired result by means of a repeated cycle of operations. An iterative process should be convergent, i.e. it should become closer to the desired result as the number of iterations increases. Thus, we sort of flip-flop using convergent and divergent thinking styles, with the important element of that soak time that I mentioned before, the time in between to allow your brain to catch up. And sometimes when you're having a little rest from this and your brain is catching up, you will actually come up with more ideas. So in phase one, the definition phase, this is all about the preparation. So we need to find out the facts, where we are now, where we want to be. The mood should be focused and analytical. The thinking style popularly associated with left hemisphere of the brain, so linear, logical, sequential, algorithmic, and processing. And we have to ask how we can drill down to find the root cause. And this will help at this stage to adopt an attitude almost like an insistent child who keeps asking the same question over and over again. You've probably experienced this, why, until they've extracted every last jot of information. And there's different rules of thumb of whether it should be 3 whys or 5 whys. I don't think that's necessarily important. It's as many whys as you need to actually get the outcome. So just to recap, at this point. So to define the problem, to recognize the opportunities. So define, discover, and determine at each stage. So how does the problem manifest itself? Who does the problem affect? What is the impact of the problem? How does the problem work? Is it simple or complex? What are the root causes? What are the criteria for success? What are the constraints in both time and resources? And what are the priorities? So we're in the definitions phase, and we're defining, discovering, and determining within that phase. Then we move into the discovery phase. So again, define, discover, and determine within the phase. So in discovery, we're presenting a clear explanation of the problem. We construct a strategy to tackle that problem. We compose a short, concise statement of all or part of the problem that is to be addressed. The discovery point of this, we seek analogies from other domains, generate non-obvious ideas, and find as many ideas as possible. Again, remembering not to judge at this point. Switch off and take a break if you need to, come back to it. The determination stage of discovery, reflect on the nature of and diversity of the ideas. Have all the permutations and combinations been explored? And have enough ideas been produced for novel concepts to emerge? Then as we move into the determination stage, again, we're going to run it through the define, discover, and determine. So at define, we sort and sift the ideas into categories, construct realistic possibilities with the ideas. It's quality, not quantity at this point. Select 3 or 4 different concepts for final evaluation. Moving into discover, you recall your criteria from the problem definition stage, compare the alternatives, and choose your optional solution. And at the determine stage of this, you present your chosen solution as a clear proposal, examine possible barriers to acceptance, and produce an implementation plan. Okay. So let's go through each bit now in more depth, and please feel free to take notes if you wish. So in define, we're analysing the evidence and we're describing the symptoms. To describe a problem, there's 6 classic questions really to ask: who, what, when, where, how, and why. And because our problem solving process is so wide-ranging, not all questions we suggest will be as relevant as others. So how does the problem manifest itself? In other words, how did it come to your attention? Was it a sudden failure, or did you feel it coming? Letters in the post or a phone call, or is it one of those nagging problems that's always been there? What are the symptoms? Describe the problem. For example, if you say, I feel ill, it's not enough. Exactly how do you feel ill? You have to give the doctor, for example, more information. Similarly, if you're saying my car won't go, that needs qualifying too. Does the engine turn over at all, or does it stop and start? You'll have your own examples here. I'm just trying to give you a few examples to illustrate the points at each stage. So who does the problem affect? Whose is the problem? Is it yours? Is it someone else's? In a business context, that's someone else is your customer. In a health context, it's your patient. In education, it would be your student, the end user of whatever activity you're involved in. Can you get rid of the problem by outsourcing a solution? An example here could be the roof is leaking. So you call the builders. If you do, you face another series of questions. How will you monitor the situation? How will you fund the project? Can you trust the subcontractor to deliver on time? If you can't answer these questions, then it's likely that the problem will return. So what is the impact of the problem? What are the consequences? For example, our dispatches are getting later and later. So our customers are complaining. So they might take their business elsewhere. So our business will suffer. So you will lose your jobs and so on. Again, you can think of your own problems. I'm simply giving you some examples here. So when we're in Discover, we're exploring the structure of the problem and we're finding the root causes. Whilst remaining analytical, you need to relax somewhat and look around the problem. Step back and try to see the big picture. Look at it from different points of view. This is where we're keeping our judgment out of things. So how does the problem work? Is there some sort of internal dynamic? For example, low performance equals low remuneration equals low morale equals low performance. So we can get a reverse of a spiral of decline here. Is it a string of consequences? For example, housing chains. I can't move in until you move out. How can you get the market moving? Can you draw a flowchart to illustrate the structure? Some people prefer to see things visually, some people don't. So try something different. Is the problem simple or complex? How do different elements interact? For example, is there a knock-on effect within your organization in terms of morale or allocation of resources? Obviously, the larger the project, the more complex it is, but apparently simple problems can have complications. For example, how can I carry out market research into my new product without disclosing it to my competitors? Even the simplest of situations can have snags. Another example, 5 of us can drive to the party, but if we decide to leave the car there, we can only fit 4 in a taxi to get home. So what is the root cause? It can be very satisfying to think that there is a single root cause of any phenomenon, that any proposition can be reduced to its simplest expression. However, that may rush to judgment. So bear in mind that apparently complex problems might in fact be a combination of relatively uncomplicated ones, which may or may not be interdependent. You may find a string of single answers forming a taproot, a single unambiguous cause, but each question why may have more than one answer, each answer forming a new branch of the root network. For example, why is there so much litter? Because people drop it. Why? Because people don't care. Why? Because they're detached from the consequences. Why? Because they're ignorant. Why? Because they haven't been educated. Or it could be, there are no litter bins. Why? Because we haven't put any there. Why? Because we haven't the resources to empty them. Why? Because we have other priorities. So can you see where that's going? In the determine stage, it's deciding how to attempt a solution. We now need to become more judgmental at this stage, fixing upon a plan of action. It's possible for a complex problem to be broken into manageable parts. If you can do that, if you can break it down, that might make it a little bit easier. Are the constituent parts of the problem separable, or are they interdependent? What are the criteria for success? How will you know if you found the right solution? Criteria might include effectiveness, acceptability, ease of implementation, profitability, etc. You need to decide these now. They make up the target you're aiming at, which you'll have to recall at the end of the problem-solving process to judge the likely success of your potential solutions. In many ways, you are listing the minimum requirements for the project to proceed. What are the constraints in terms of both time and resources? Is it important or is it urgent? There's a real distinction. Is a stopgap solution feasible to give you enough time to create a permanent solution? You know, sticking plasters are both cheap and effective in the appropriate circumstances, but a tourniquet is sometimes an absolute necessity. What can you afford to spend in terms of time and money? Is it essential to set limits at this point to prevent a project spiraling out of control? An unaffordable solution is not a real solution, it's another problem. Would a cost-benefit analysis help, maybe? What are the priorities? Can you set sub-goals on the way to a complete solution? Again, that's breaking things down. That is, can progress be gradual? Can it be step by step? Or does it have to be all at once? Very often you can make a choice yourself. For example, it is possible to introduce reforms into an organization gradually. A new product might be launched region by region, again, breaking it down. If you're building a bridge or an air terminal, it's better to be ready once it's opened. What are the consequences of a partial solution? Another good question. Partial solutions allow for a certain approach, being flexible enough to react to feedback, adjusting your solution if necessary. Now, would that hinder or help complete a solution? By the end of this phase, you should have a good understanding of the problem, its structure, its dynamics, and its complexity. You should be thinking of a plan of how to tackle it. You should be formulating a concise definition of the problem, or definitions if you decide to break it down and solve it bit by bit. As I've said before, very often defining a problem is half the solution. Sometimes, indeed, it's the whole solution, just getting that clear definition right in the first place. If, for instance, the root cause of your car's breakdown is the failure of a particular component, then the solution is available off the shelf. You don't need to look any further. Your problem's solved. On the other hand, some problems are still hard to solve even when you know the answer. The major cause of lung cancer is smoking tobacco, but implementing a simple solution, stop smoking, is a problem all of its own. If you're able to come up with a concise definition, you have to ask whether you know enough about the problem to attempt a solution. Recognition of opportunity, if you're looking at creative problem solving, is always going to provide more answers and questions. Even at this analytical stage, you should have found more of what you need to know about how to solve your problem before moving on to look at possible solutions. But be sure to note down any interesting thoughts, because seemingly irrelevant ideas, which might be useful in other areas. To go back to the point about taking a rest, one of the hardest parts of problem solving is stopping ourselves from rushing to judgment. So this is why we need to take a break at each stage, and that way we're actually more effective. We can switch off and do something else and come back to it. Your unconscious mind will be processing whilst you're doing that, and when you come back to it refreshed, you'll come up with even more good ideas. Because when we sort of switched off, we're not completely switched off. We're just sort of in like standby mode, and the ideas will pop into our head when we're least expecting them. You've probably all had the experience at some point of being in the shower and you have your best idea and you wish you got a waterproof pen and marker so that you can jot them down, because sometimes you come out 10 minutes later and you've forgotten some of your best ideas. The notion of letting ideas incubate is not new. One of the expressions is sleep on it. So if you sleep on an idea, sometimes you come back to it with a fresh pair of eyes. So that's phase one. So into phase two, discovery. So just drilling down into a bit more detail with this. This is quite a meaty subject, so I'm actually going through some of my notes here to keep me on track. So the discovery phase, this is a bit more relaxed. Exploring broadly, gathering new ideas as widely as we can, the style of thinking. So exploring broadly, gathering ideas as widely as we can. This style of thinking, some people would associate it with the right-hand hemisphere of the brain. How might we get where we want to be? So it's really really exploring and coming up with as many ideas as possible. And by now at this stage, we've got a deeper knowledge of our problem. And if we think of the depth of knowledge as a vertical axis, then we're going to look for fresh ideas along the horizontal axis, breadth of knowledge. Of course, vertical preeminence counts for nothing on the horizontal axis. We're going to try and find shallow and half understood concepts. Although expert knowledge is always welcome at this stage, it is not all that important. During this non-judgmental idea gathering phase, we are searching for material which we will bring back into our ideas of expertise to build it into our own solutions to be assessed on our own terms. If we try to leap from one height to another, we may fall, but bearing in mind that we are pre-concept, we have nothing to lose. We might even enjoy the trip. So again, no silly ideas, just, get it all out there, get it all out of your minds, sharing it with colleagues, bouncing ideas off each other, not being judgmental, just getting as many ideas out onto the table as possible. So prepare to find the solutions. This section is actually it's the final iteration of the last section of phase one, making sure we understand exactly what we're looking for. It sets the agenda which we're going to follow through for the rest of the process. To use that overused and little understood expression, this is where we define the box. At the box, as in the box we're going to think outside of. I've got a bit of a quote here that you might find interesting. If there is a secret to creativity, this is it. We are not limited to our own experiences. We are not limited to our own minds. It is our minds which reach out and seize inspiration, not the other way round. We are the motive force behind ingenuity. From this standpoint, we can either sit around waiting to take hold of inspiration if it floats by, or we can go looking for it. We can search other people's minds, other people's experience. As you'll see, we are not even limited to our own species. That's quite interesting. So moving on to phase three, the determination stage. We use the word determination not only in a sense of judgment, determining the best solution, but also in a sense of resolve, the determination to go ahead with more certainty, that we have identified the optimal rather than the acceptable. I think I've twisted in my chair and you're getting half my face again. So this section is all about refocus and synthesis, engineering the ideas from phase two into practical, realistic possibilities and then assessing them. The strategies we adopt should be both pragmatic and attainable. Evaluating possible solutions rigorously is critically important. There is no point in coming up with creative, imaginative ideas which are totally impractical. So, we're going to need to plan this out and actually take some action on what we're coming up with here. So defining in this last section of phase two, setting the agenda for what is to follow. Preparation should be the arrangement and rearrangement of possibilities from the previous phase into concepts which are capable of evaluation. Sort and sift the ideas into categories. The categories chosen will reflect what was discovered about the problem way back in phase one. For example, a bottom-up or top-down approach, gradual, step-by-step, or all at once, stopgap or permanent, high-tech, low-tech, top price, mid-price, or budget, so on. Separate the good ideas from lots of ideas. As I said, there's no bad ideas, so we're just separating the good ideas from the lots of ideas. And now we're looking at quality over quantity, and possibly selecting 3 or 4 different concepts for the final evaluation. Whilst the emphasis is on practical and pragmatic, we should not be afraid to assess properly seemingly eccentric ideas. As I said before, with the 3M example, somebody was trying to come up with reusable glue, and that's what led to the post-it notes. Right, so investigating the alternatives and finding the best solutions. This is the rigorous analysis across the breadth of all the possibilities that we've come up with. If you recall your criteria for success from the problem definition stage, because we have hopefully been exploring the widest range of options, it is once again essential to confirm that we are proposing to solve the problem we originally identified. We may have gone off at a bit of a tangent, so sometimes you need to go back and just check in with where you started, that you're still actually working to solve the problem that you identified in the first place. This is the point. At this point, what can happen? A lot of projects sort of go a bit awry. So finding a solution to a different problem is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a different thing. So it's just being aware of that. It might well be a great opportunity. For instance, you may have found a likely looking solution which far exceeds your expectations, but also exceeds the budget constraints you set yourself. So again, you need to be checking back. Recalling that cybernetic aspect of common sense reasoning, the ability to revise your decisions as better information. The ability to revise your decisions as better information becomes available, because at this point you now know a lot more things than when you started. So you just need to review that. So the ability to revise your decisions as better information becomes available. You're faced with 2 choices. You can return to the beginning of this whole process with a new problem definition, how to increase our budget to realize the enormous opportunities of our fabulous new concept, for example, or you carry on full steam ahead. It is surprising how often people choose the latter alternative, trusting that enthusiasm will be a subject for sound finance, forgetting that we are still in the pre-concept phase. We're not actually committed to anything. So comparing alternatives can be easier said than done. Again, one of the points at which we are liable to make mistakes, we have to assess the choices as dispassionately as possible. Evaluation by a group rather than an individual should be more detached, but runs the risk of agreeing upon the lowest common denominator. There exists a wide range of formal decision-making tools which allow you to fully examine cost-benefit impact, depending on the nature of your problem. Some may be more suitable than others. In essence, most are just variations on other methods. So comparing new concepts against the best existing solution, it can be used to choose the prime solution of several rival complete concepts, but can also be used to refine and develop proposals until a superior solution emerges and any negatives that are coming out of this can be removed. If at this stage the problem is not resolved, then you must return to the earlier point, right back at the beginning if it's necessary to do so. But once more, remember, we are still pre-concept, so our only commitment at this point is our brain power. The other thing that you're going to need to take into account at some point is risk, and just to obviously there's a difference between calculated risk and mere gambling. Taking the time as we have to examine the problems and the possibilities at this stage should reduce the chance of failure. but it's never completely, can never be completely removed. Acceptance of risk necessarily implies the inevitability of occasional disappointment. And here's one of the sadder aspects of innovation, really. The best ideas are not automatically accepted. Some domains, some people can be extremely resistant to change. So that's something that you have to take into account when you're going to present your final solutions to whatever the problem was. Depending on the context, it could be that you've got a solution, but somebody in your team, or depending on the context, your team, your company, your organization, they may have their own opinions and not like your new ideas. So sometimes that can scupper what could be a really, really good idea. Okay. Right. So determine. This is like looking to the future. So this is the final part of our problem solving process. After all that exploration and wandering around, we have to refocus our minds and concentrate on that imagined future. So your solution may exceed your criteria for success, or it may only be a partial solution. And does this affect the resources you need? Do you need to return to the beginning with a rephrased problem definition? So once you've gone through this process and you've got more knowledge, and you go back to the original problem, maybe the original problem's changed. As I said, change is nearly always resisted one way or another. So if your plan fails to convince, it's not necessarily the fault of those it fails to convince. It is your plan, and therefore it's your failure. If you're in any kind of business, you will have competitors. So how will they react? It's a question to be asked. Do you need to protect your intellectual property? How can you safeguard your investment? How will the solution affect you and your organization? How can you sell your solution to your colleagues, get their buy-in to it? And how can you sell it to the wider public if that's what you ultimately wanting to do? And how will you adapt to the new situation? Can you control the impact and response once your solution is applied? How are you going to monitor the implementation? Do you have the resources to cope with likely obstacles? Will you have the flexibility to react to feedback? Do you have a plan B or even a plan C? And again, could you cope with a runaway success? Then we're coming to produce the implementation plan. So we've already accepted there's a chance of failure, but in the knowledge that failure is always more expensive further down the road, minimizing that risk constitutes foresight. The implementation plan should represent determination and resolution in both senses, as a final expression of this process and as the first step into the next. At the end of this stage, you should have a practical response to the questions posed by your problem definition from the first phase. And if not, you need to reframe it, restructure it, or split your questions into parts and start again. So what's next? Well, the next bit is to put your idea into action. Easy, or maybe not easy. But this is where the real work begins. But if you consider this, by going through a structured thinking process at the pre-concept stage of innovation, you should have achieved the following: a deeper understanding of the situation, be it a problem or opportunity, a wider exploration of the possibilities, a practical prospect of success, and a realistic imagined future. As I sort of pointed out at the beginning of this, as human beings, we possess a great capacity to think, but actually understanding our own thinking processes and why we think the way we do is critical to your decision making process. So if you know this process, it may seem very long here and now as you're learning that process, but once you know it, you can run simple problems through it really quite quickly, but it's important to go through every stage of that and not just jump to the conclusion, because then you will miss some of the possibilities. So I'm going to share the slides. I'll get the slides attached to this presentation. I hope that it's made some sense. I think probably just going through the slides and going back to, I'm just looking at my other notes here. So if I can do a little bit of a recap, I think that would be helpful to wrap all this up together. So we're starting out with defining, discovering, and determining at each stage. So in the defining stage, this is where we have the problem and we're recognizing the opportunities. The questions are, how does the problem manifest itself? Who does the problem affect? What is the impact of the problem? That's defining it. Discovering it in the defined stage is, how does the problem work? Is it simple or complex? What are the root causes? And in the determination stage of define, what are the criteria for success? What are the constraints in both time and resources? And what are the priorities? Moving into the discover phase, again, we're going to define, discover, and determine in this phase. So in the discover phase, at the point of definition, we present a clear explanation of the problem, construct a strategy to tackle that problem, compose a short, concise statement of all or part of that problem to be addressed, seek analogies from other domains, generate non-obvious ideas, and find as many ideas as possible, and then reflect upon the nature of the diversity of those ideas, have all the permutations and combinations being explored, and have enough ideas to produce the novel concepts to emerge. And then in the definition stage, we're going through define, discover, and determine. So in the determine stage, defining, sort, sift ideas into categories, construct realistic possibilities with the ideas, and it's quality, not quantity. Select 3 or 4 different concepts for final evaluation. At the discovery stage of this, recall your criteria from the problem definition stage, compare the alternatives, choose your optional solution, and then at the determination stage of determine, present your chosen solution as a clear proposal, examine the possible barriers to acceptance, and produce an implementation plan. So if I can now take any questions that you have, there seems to be quite a bit in the chat box, and I'm just checking my other device because I'm hoping those questions are coming through on an email. Right, now I think that's what we'll do. I'll get the questions offline, and I'll put the questions into a slide with some answers, and then we'll attach that to the recording of this presentation. Okay, so I will wish you all a good afternoon. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much.